The source of the infection, of this entire kingdom's decay, the Radiance is the true final boss of Hollow Knight. And does she ever earn that title? This is a massive challenge of every skill you have learned: combat, platforming, management of your soul, and patience. Taking place across 5 different phases, and by far the largest arena we have ever seen. Phase 1 will take place primarily in this relatively basic arena, bottomless pits to either side, but otherwise nothing to look out for here. After dealing 350 damage, we'll move on to Phase 2, and the arena will begin to cover itself in spikes, one half at a time, alternating sides every 5 seconds or so, or whenever the knight makes contact with them. Thankfully, since these spikes are more of a hazard of the arena than an attack of the Radiance, they only deal 1 damage, but you'll have to contend with them as you deal 400 more damage to get to Phase 3. Here, the spikes become permanent fixtures on the outside of the arena, though still disappearing momentarily should you ever make contact with them. 250 damage later, you'll be on to Phase 4, and all 3 of those phases were just a warm-up. You'll platform your way up to the upper section of the arena, a series of several floating platforms over a bottomless pit, stretching wide enough that at any point, you'll likely only see half of the platforms on screen. To pass this phase, you'll need to deal 700 more damage. Thankfully, you don't have any spikes to deal with. The final phase, the Ascent, only requires you to climb this extremely tall series of platforms while evading the attacks of the Radiance, and when you get to the top, land the final blow. But between the beginning and the end, she has a veritable arsenal of attacks to try and stop us with. She has the Solar Beams, the Sun Orbs, Sword Spiral, Sword Flurry, Sword Fall, Wall of Light, and Beam Assault. The Radiance is an entirely new kind of boss. Though many of her attacks are similar to some we've encountered before, they come together to form a fight that feels like an entirely new genre of challenge. Every one of her attacks either affects the entire arena or homes in on us regardless of our position. Because of that, her exact position almost wouldn't matter if it didn't dictate the starting positions of her Sword Spiral and Solar Beams. Beyond that, all we care about where she is whether or not we can hit her. And, for the first time ever, we have a boss whose actual body does not have a hitbox under any circumstances. We can directly come into contact her as much as we want and suffer no consequences, which, ironically, makes her the easiest boss to nail pogo in the game. And good thing too, because we are definitely gonna make use of that. But all that to say that this boss practically feels built from the ground up to encourage you to play patiently and wait for her to come to you. Approaching her through the absolute onslaught of projectiles can feel overwhelming, but let's dive in and make it all feel a little more manageable. The Solar Beams are essentially the exact same as the beams we dealt with when fighting the Crystal Guardian and the Enraged Guardian. The small sliver of light they begin as is not a hitbox, but a telegraph of where the hitbox will be, spreading out in a perfect pattern of 8. She'll always perform this attack 3 times in a row, but the exact rotation of each set seems a little bit random. One thing is certain, she'll never position the beams the same way twice in a row. This means you'll have to dodge the first set by reaction alone, but for the second and third, all you have to do is stand directly in a spot where a beam has just been fired, and you'll be safe 100% of the time. This gives you the easiest opportunity to either deal damage or heal out of any of her attacks, as you'll have the entire window of time between the second set of beams and her next attack, and odds are that you'll be in a great position to launch off an Abyss Shriek or 2, racking up massive damage. The Sun Orbs are extremely comparable to the Soul Orbs used by the Soul Warrior, Soul Master, and others, but these are essentially a more powerful version, being faster, persisting for longer, and having a much tighter turning radius that makes evading them another matter entirely. Much like the Solar Beams, the Radiance will always summon 3 of these in a row, and honestly, their sheer persistence makes me consider this her most dangerous attack, at least in phases 1 and 2. You may also notice that this attack and many of her others aren't actually telegraphed by the Radiance herself, but rather require you to simply focus on the arena at large and be aware of how those attacks appear. Thankfully, the Sun Orbs have a pretty clear summoning animation, but as for dodging them, you definitely want to draw them into the ground. Whether or not you can is going to largely depend on the angle they're summoned at, and whether or not you want to get any damage in on the Radiance while she does this attack. If you just want to focus on dodging the orbs, I recommend primarily making use of your Shade Cloak and dodging back and forth along the ground to draw them downwards. Again, like the Soul Orbs, you can also simply destroy them by shadow dashing through them. If you want to get in some damage though, I recommend taking a lot of advantage of the Radiance's lack of a body hitbox, and jumping up to land a Nail Pogo on her head before falling back down to draw the orbs down into the ground. For a safer strategy, use Descending Dark after the Nail Pogo to give yourself extra insurance against the orbs and deal a little more damage. Soul permitting, of course. Mind you, that's all in phases 1 and 2. This attack is a very different beast in the platform arena of phase 4, though in many ways, it's a fair bit easier. You won't be able to dodge along the ground seeing as there isn't any, but the platforms cover a large variety of angles, and the orbs will often just crash into them without you having to worry too much about them. Be careful though, as a unique property of the Sun Orbs is that they can phase through platforms if the orb has only just started moving, as a sort of grace period. This attack is also the most dangerous if Radiance is off screen, as they can build up enough momentum to be extremely difficult to dodge when you're not anticipating them. So, in phase 4, try not to let the Radiance out of your sight. The Sword Spiral is very similar to the Solar Beams, though she only summons 1 wave instead of 3. The trade-off is that there are 12 swords, not 8, and they all have these curving trajectories. And while all 12 swords in a set will curve in the same direction, either clockwise or counterclockwise, it's impossible to tell which way they'll go before they launch. Thankfully, it doesn't actually matter too much. If you're between 2 of their trajectories while close enough to the Radiance, their curve isn't steep enough to hit you, and if you're far enough away that it does matter, they move slowly enough that you have plenty of time to get out of the way. The biggest threat this attack poses is in phase 4, where sometimes the Radiance will spawn so close to you and use this attack that the sword's initial appearance before they launch will hit you. In this situation, there's really only one recourse, and that's to use Desolate Dive as soon as she appears directly above you to avoid the initial spawn, and then use the invincibility frames to position yourself safely between 2 swords. After all that, this is another good time to let loose with an Abyss Shriek. The Sword Flurry is probably most comparable to Grimm's Firestorm attack, sending wave after wave of projectiles at you horizontally. Thankfully, all from the same direction, but be aware that this attack can be initiated from either the left or the right. This attack changes quite a bit between the first 2 phases and the 4th phase. In phases 1 and 2, she will always summon 4 waves of swords, but in phase 4, she will only summon 2. Now, I want to lead by highly recommending that you always dodge through the large gaps between the swords, whether or not your Shade Cloak is available. While it is possible to dodge straight through the swords with a well-timed Shadow Dash, the timing of the swords is frequent enough that relying solely on the Shade Cloak will see you struggling between the columns of swords as you wait for it to recharge. And I say it's just much better to be in the habit of dashing through the gaps so you can avoid this attack without having to worry about watching your Shade Cloak cooldown. In addition, this is a good time to bring up the Radiance's attack frequency. She will essentially always use another attack before her last one is totally off screen, especially in the case of her sword attacks. So you want to be finished dodging them as quickly as possible to be prepared for the next attack. Of course, don't be afraid to Shadow Dash through the swords if you're in a tight spot. I just recommend not having that be your plan A. Swordfall is a particularly dangerous attack, functioning nearly identically to the Sword Flurry. The same 4 rows of swords, only vertical. Thankfully, these swords will only come from above, and never below. Actually, in many ways, I consider this to be the easier of the 2 attacks. For one, the Knight's hitbox has a smaller width than it does height, so while it's not possible to dodge between the smaller gaps in the swords coming horizontally, these vertical ones are a different story. The larger gaps will still definitely be easier, but be aware that if you don't have a choice but to try and slip through these thinner gaps, you might as well try. Also be careful of the hilts of the swords. They may look like little more than a design flourish, but the hitbox of the swords actually does get wider there. Swordfall is also the only attack that the Radiance will use in Phase 3, as well as being the only attack she actually drops in Phase 4. Because of this, and the fact that out of all of her attacks, it's the one that most restricts your horizontal movement, I also want to cover how best to avoid the floor spikes at this point. In general, it's pretty simple. Just stay on whatever side of the arena they're not on, right? They also give you a bit of a grace period if they begin spawning under your feet, taking an extra moment to appear if you're still in contact with the glowing ground. But sometimes, and often due to the swordfall attack, you'll be somewhat trapped on one side of the arena as spikes are spawning beneath you, and even I, the world's biggest proponent of nail pogos, can't in good conscience recommend nail pogoing your way to safety when there's so much going on. So here's our secret weapon against the spikes. As I said, they'll disappear if you make contact with them, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to take damage. Use a Descending Dark while over top of the spikes, and they'll disappear before your invincibility frames wear off, giving you some extremely valuable breathing room before the spikes reappear on the other side of the stage. Even if you don't have any soul to spare, remember that the spikes only do 1 damage, contrary to every one of Radiance's attacks. And if it comes down to the choice between taking 2 damage from an attack, or taking 1 damage and removing the spikes for a second, it's really no contest. As for dealing with Swordfall in Phase 3, it's pretty simple. Just jump and land 1 upward slash in between every row of swords, using the jump to reposition yourself to the next gap you want to use. Don't feel too pressured to get in an attack between every row. This right here is the entire phase. She's not going anywhere. So if the nails are leaving inconvenient gaps that have got you locked to one side, just wait it out. You'll get your chance. It can also be very tempting to unleash some Abyss Shrieks during this phase, seeing as she's right there and not moving, but I recommend against it. The time between phases 3 and 4 is just about the only completely safe opportunity you'll have to heal in this whole fight, and it lasts long enough that you could genuinely heal 6 masks if you have the soul. So just use phase 3 to build up that soul just by dealing damage with your nail. Even if you're at full health and you don't need to heal, I still recommend hoarding your soul right now, as this is already one of her shortest phases, and letting loose with your spells in phase 4 can make that phase much quicker and easier. The Wall of Light is comparable to the Traitor Lord's Shockwave, as one of the only attacks which outright requires the use of invincibility to dodge, covering the stage from top to bottom, moving from one end to the other. The only thing that can halt its progress is if the Radiance immediately follows it up with a second one. If she does that, the first wall will disappear about halfway across the stage, but you'll still have the second one to deal with. Either way, you're not getting out of this without either Shade Cloaking through or using a Descending Dark. Much like the Sword Flurry, this is another attack you want to dodge as quickly as possible, as you don't want to be stuck on the wrong side of it waiting for your Shade Cloak to recharge when she follows up with a second attack, especially if that second attack is a Sword Flurry from the other direction. Yikes. So, if your Shade Cloak is on cooldown and you see the wall coming, it's definitely worth it to burn a Descending Dark, even if she's not in the range of its damage. Her final attack, Beam Assault, is only used in Phase 5, and it's the only attack she uses. It's basically a single beam out of the solar beams, only over and over and over again, targeted in your direction and slightly wider. She'll basically pester you with this attack during the entire ascent. On paper, it's really simple. It has a pretty decent telegraph. It takes until you're about halfway up the climb until it starts properly targeting you directly, and they're not especially rapid. But what this attack preys on is your adrenaline. After getting through all 4 of her previous phases, your hands are shaking, your heart is pounding. Every individual beam feels 10 times faster than it actually is. So as much as I know that, and as much as I've personally experienced it, I can't give any better advice than to take a slow, measured approach to the final climb. Stand still on each platform and move accordingly with each beam that she fires. When you get to the top, don't hesitate. All it takes is 1 attack to finish this. So, our game plan. This fight is honestly as difficult as you make it. The Radiance plays on your greed, your impatience. In phases 2 and 4, she often hovers over top of spikes or tiny platforms over bottomless pits. It's as if she knows she's somewhere you'd have to take a risk to reach, but still, she just hovers there, as though she's saying, "Come and get me." Well, our greatest asset in what would otherwise be the trickiest situations is Descending Dark. Faced with an opponent whose primary strategy seems to be to teleport away and then fill the screen with different projectiles and hitboxes, oftentimes all we have to do is close the distance with a Descending Dark, avoiding projectiles, removing spikes, and dealing damage all at once. Of course, much like many of our past foes, we'll need to get in our slashes to feed our hungry soul meter. But Radiance is surprisingly simple to stay up close to. The only 2 attacks which actually originate from her are her Solar Beams and her Sword Spiral, both of which are heavily telegraphed by her glowing brightly. If she's not glowing, you can essentially stay in her bubble and keep wailing on her. The biggest struggle then comes from the fact that she constantly teleports out of reach, starting the cycle over. In truth, there are really 2 ways to go about this fight. Either wait for her to come to you, or bring the fight to her. Don't feel the need to commit to either strategy. From moment to moment, just use whichever one you need based on her positioning, whether or not you have enough soul to use Descending Dark, and so on. Phase 4 is definitely the toughest of them all, asking you to balance your platforming skills with your attack evading skills as she repeatedly flees to the far reaches of this massive arena. My main recommendation is to stay on the top central platform whenever you're not pursuing Radiance or dodging. Don't overextend yourself by chasing her to the furthest platforms. If she does appear over there, just move close enough that you keep her on screen so you can avoid any sword spirals or sun orbs. If she appears on one of the closer platforms, close in, possibly using Descending Dark, and then let her have it. Pay attention to how she transitions to her final phase, using this teleport that leaves a trail of particles moving upwards. While it's not as completely safe as a gap between phases 3 and 4, this is your last opportunity to heal. So if you do have any soul left, you might as well, as this far down, her beam assault is incredibly unlikely to hit you. More importantly, do not try to heal further up the ascent, no matter how possible it seems. You've come this far, conquered so much. Now's not the time for second guessing. Make the climb, and finish strong. Thank you so much for watching Boss Blitz. We are finished with everything outside of Godhome. So next time we are taking on Oro and Mato.